the United States government actually did carry out on our citizens experiments involving radiation. In one scientists injected plutonium into 18 patients without their knowledge. In another, doctors exposed indigent cancer patients to excessive doses of radiation, a treatment from which it is virtually impossible that they could ever benefit.
Shut up, conspiracy theorist.
Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. Here is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. The Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male was an infamous and unethical clinical study conducted between 1932 and 1972 by the U.S. Public Health Service. The purpose of this study was to observe the natural history of untreated syphilis. The African American men in the study were told they were receiving free health care from the United States government. The Public Health Service started working on the study in 1932 in collaboration with the Tuskegee University, a historically black college in Alabama. Investigators enrolled in the study a total of 600 impoverished African American sharecroppers from Macomb County University. Of these men, 399 had previously contracted syphilis before the study began, and 201 did not have the disease. So this was an intentional poisoning of peaceful people under the guise of free health care from the kind, virtuous government there to protect us. The syphilis experiments in Guatemala were United States-led human experiments conducted in Guatemala from 1946 to 1948. The experiments were led by physician John Charles Cutler, who also participated in the late stages of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Doctors infected soldiers, prostitutes, prisoners, mental patients with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases without the informed consent of the subjects. The experiment resulted in at least 83 deaths. Now, there is one aspect to this where it's the government trying to hide their immorality and keep it secret. But, I mean, at some point it's likely that you are going to get caught. So what they simultaneously do is they fund research or promote people in the research community that are already advocating things that they would like to do, which is come up with some justification for increasing the amount of control. Whether it's, well, poverty exists, so we need to increase control over the economy. Bad businessmen exist, so we need to increase control over the economy. There's terrible immigrants, there's terrible terrorists, there's drug dealers. Give us more power. So we here have a book called The Population Bomb, a best-selling book written by Stanford University professor Paul R. Ehrlich and his wife Anne Ehrlich, who was uncredited until 1968. It predicted a worldwide famine in the 1970s and 80s due to overpopulation. So what they do is they scare us with this overpopulation or climate change, or they scare us about drugs and immigrants and terrorists and poverty, as well as other major societal upheavals, and advocated immediate action to limit population growth. Here's a quote from the book. "The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. At this late date, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the worldwide death rate." And of course, the opposite happened. There's more food being produced now than ever before. There'd be even more if the state wasn't regulating food and stopping it from crossing borders, stopping people from trading, and regulating the agricultural industry. So they intentionally give us a lie, worry about this terrible thing that's going to happen if we don't increase the amount of power that we have. Now, Paul Ehrlich actually wrote another book after this one, completely failed to come to fruition in 1968. Paul Ehrlich later wrote a book with his wife Anne and a man named John P. Holdren called Ecoscience, Population, Resources, and Environment. It's important because these aren't just some kooks that are out there. They actually have high positions of power. John Holdren is an American scientist who served as the senior advisor to President Barack Obama on science and technology issues through his roles as assistant to the president for science and technology, director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and co-chair of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, getting his education at MIT as well as Stanford with Paul Ehrlich. There he is, observing President Obama signing into law. Here is a quote from page 837 in Ecoscience. To date, there has been no serious attempt in Western countries to use laws to control excessive population growth, although there exists ample authority under which population growth could be regulated. See, the word regulated is code for Group A, government, violently dominating Group B, the citizenry. So when we don't really acknowledge that these things are inherently immoral, that even if it's under the guise of science and finding things out, you still have to recognize that human beings have the right to live unaggressed. But, they just throw in the word regulation, say it's for the greater good, and people don't question it. This is why it's so important to say, yes, there might be a pandemic. Yes, many people are getting sick. However, my rights are not dependent on whether or not other people get sick. Even if they are, it doesn't therefore follow that a group of people called Congress of all groups, it doesn't therefore follow that they get to increase the amount of power they have. Oh, a terrible thing has happened. Therefore, the Mormon Church has the right to forcibly control us all and regulate the amount of children we can have. If you believe you own other people, you believe in slavery. I don't care if you call it control or regulation or for the greater good. To say I have a better claim to your body and your time than you do is to believe in slavery. For example, under the United States Constitution, effective population control programs could be enacted under the clauses that empower Congress to appropriate funds to provide for the general welfare and to regulate commerce, or under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Such laws constitutionally could be very broad. Indeed, it has been concluded that compulsory population control program laws, even including laws requiring compulsory abortion, could be sustained under the existing Constitution if the population crisis became sufficiently severe to endanger the society. Now, he wrote this book with Paul Ehrlich, who lies about how bad the population is and how, there's going to be food shortages and we need luxury taxes. Oh, shockingly, the state needs to increase power. That's the only way we could solve this thing. Nothing voluntary, nothing that involves human beings trading and innovating in ideas. It's just a fake justification to increase state power. So the fact that they're using fear, you just want grandma to die if you don't want the state to totally control the economy and stop people from going to work. No, there is an alternative agenda, and it's based on lies and fake science. Let's continue with Ecoscience, page 783. A case in point was the sudden imposition in 1976 of compulsory sterilization in some Indian states and government employees in Delhi following 2 decades of discouraging results from voluntary family planning. People should long ago have begun exploring, developing, and discussing all the possible means of population control, but they did not, and time has nearly run out. Oh, we're just decades away if we don't act now. Give up your rights now or the terrorists are coming for us. The development of a long-term sterilizing capsule that could be implemented under the skin and removed when pregnancy is desired by who? The owner of the body or the state? Opens additional possibilities for coercive fertility control. The capsule could be implanted at puberty and might be removed with official permission for a limited number of births. No capsule that would last as long as 30 years or more has yet been developed, but it is technically within the realm of possibility. Ecoscience, John P. Holdren and Paul Ehrlich, page 787. Here on page 788, they list evolution of some relatively coercive measures for fertility reduction, the state owning your body. This is a further justification to increase state power. This also has the overall tone of, well, if this were true, we would know about it. Well, people do not know about these things. Or the fact that these are not just everyday people. These are people with great positions of power. Page 939, Ecoscience. Idealistically, we might enter a plea here for surrendering some national sovereignty to a world government, but it is apparent that any movement in that direction will be extremely slow at best. Valuable as the United Nations has been in many respects, citation 125, can't wait to read that one, it is clear that it will not become a supranational government in the foreseeable future. I'm super devastated. There seems to be, however, some chance that humanity might be able to move much more rapidly than it has in the past towards international agreements on the control of the world commons. So at first glance, one might be looking at the U.S. government's response to the virus, the pandemic, and saying, well, this looks like a clear power grab. They might have, ulterior motives here. But we actually have documented cases in the case of John P. Holdren and Paul Ehrlich. And it's not like these people were ever called out and they were fired and there were hearings. How do we make sure this never happens again? This was totally unrecognized on a large scale. But hey, at least that we got to the bottom of that Russia collusion, right? Here is something that happened in 1974 to 1975. Memorandum for the President by Henry A. Kissinger. This is referred to as National State Security Memorandum 200. Here are the findings and a short summary of it. We can also go to Wikipedia. That was contemplated originally on December 10th, 1974, by United States National Security Advisor under the direction of Henry Kissinger. It was adopted as official U.S. policy by President Gerald Ford in November of 1975. So, we hear about this Nixon spying on, his opponent. That's this huge deal that he is impeached for. But Gerald Ford, same thing happens. Actually, Nixon was never impeached. I forgot that. The basic thesis of this memorandum was that population growth in the least developed countries, LDCs, is a concern to U.S. national security because it would tend to risk civil unrest and political instability in countries that had a high potential for economic development. The policy gives paramount importance to population control measures and the promotion of contraception among 13 countries. So here we have a plan to promote less kids having babies. Now, different discussion. What are some methods that they use in America to promote, anti-family values, anti-people coming together and having kids? Well, there's a clear male-female divide where they just fake this wage gap and say men need to be afraid of women and women need to be in the workforce. That is a clear agenda. Now, doesn't mean they don't have a right to, work or anything like that. It means there is a concentrated effort, and we have documented evidence. Oh, no, they do it in 13 countries, but not a 14th in America. That's just ridiculous. This is to control rapid population growth. No, that is the justification for violently dominating others, which the U.S. deems inimical to the socio-political and economic growth of these countries. Oh, so they're just doing it for the economy and the well-being of others. The named countries, 13 countries, are named in the report as particularly problematic with respect to U.S. security interests. India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines, Turkey, Nigeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil. So here's what they do is they say, this terrible thing is happening and we're only going to use it against the terrorists. Yeah, we're torturing, but we're only doing it against the terrorists. Yeah, we're spying, but it's only on people like who are going to be Timothy McVeigh's. What you justify them doing to other people, they eventually use against you. That's why we have to stand on principle and say it's illegitimate in the first place for the state to, 1, exist. 2, engage in such measures like this under the guise of overall well-being and helping the masses. Now, if you need any more evidence that the government is willing to openly poison people and harm populations intentionally, look no further than what is referred to as Agent Orange. It is a herbicide and defoilement chemical, one of the tactical use rainbow herbicides. It is widely known for its use by the U.S. military as part of herbicidal warfare program Operation Ranch Hand during the Vietnam War from 1961 to 1971. Yeah, the government's literally spraying chemicals in the sky, poisoning people, And this is not really addressed. You're like a kook for believing the government would intentionally poison people, even with all of these experiments being done openly and legislation by intellectuals working at the highest levels of government trying to justify something. So once they get caught, oh, we're just doing it for the greater good. We're not spying on people. All right, we're spying, but it's for the greater good. Up to 4 million people in Vietnam were exposed to defoilement. The government of Vietnam says as many as 3 million people have suffered illnesses because of Agent Orange. We also have Operation Seaspray, was a 1950 U.S. Navy secret experiment in which Seriana marquescens and Bacillus globuli bacteria were sprayed over the San Francisco Bay Area in California. Military tests from September 20th to 27th, 1950, the U.S. Navy released pathogens off the shore of San Francisco. So here again, we're just doing it to foreigners during a war. We'd never do it here. All right, we're doing it here. But it's for the greater good. We're just doing it to the blacks. Oh, we're just doing it to the Guatemalans. Don't worry, that could never happen here. You're safe. So just justify tyranny against total strangers. It'll all be okay. We're just torturing terrorists at Abu Ghraib. Don't worry. You love Al-Qaeda if you're against the state harming innocent people. Based on results from monitoring equipment at 43 locations around the city, the Army determined that San Francisco had received enough of the dose for nearly all of the city's 800,000 residents to inhale millions of particles each day during the week of spraying. On October 11th, 1950, 11 residents checked into the Stanford Hospital for very rare, serious urinary tract infections. Again, we have people justifying, at the highest levels of government, coercive methods of controlling the population. And Henry Kissinger, probably the most famous statesman on the planet besides any president, as far as America goes. We also have Operation Do, refers to two separate field trials conducted by the United States in the 1950s. The tests were designed to study the behavior of aerosol-released biological agents. Took place between 1951 and 1952 off the southeast coast of the United States, including near Georgia and North and South Carolina. Consisted of two sets of trials, Do 1 and Do 2. The test involved the release of 250 pounds of fluorescent particles from a minesweeper off the coast, was described in a U.S. Army report known as Dugway Special Report 162, dated August 1st, 1952. The purpose of the operation was to study the behavior of aerosol-released biological agents. And finally, we have Operation LAC. Look, my point here is that we need to recognize the facts that bioweapons have been used, governments have tried to poison their own people intentionally, and it's been covered up. So the idea that that wouldn't happen, no, it would. Well, they would do it, but only against, evil people. No, that's also not the case. Well, if they did it, everyone would know about it and you couldn't keep it secret. All of those are false. None of those are legitimate responses to the fact that we could be. I'm not saying, therefore, I know objectively 100% for a fact. I'm saying it is important to be recognized as a legitimate part of the conversation. So finally, Operation LAC, Large Area Coverage, was a U.S. Army Chemical Corps operation which dispersed microscopic zinc-cadmium sulfide particles over much of the United States and Canada in order to test dispersal patterns and the geographic range of chemical or biological weapons. Earlier tests. There were several tests that occurred prior to the first spraying affiliated with Operation LAC that proved the concept of large area coverage. Canadian historical files relating to participation in the test site, in particular 3 previous series of tests leading up to those conducted in Operation LAC, September 1950. 6 simulated attacks were conducted upon the San Francisco Bay Area. It was concluded that it was feasible to attack a seaport area with biological aerosol agents from a ship offshore. April 1952. 5 trials were conducted off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia under Operation Do, as we mentioned earlier. It was concluded that long-range aerosol clouds could obtain hundreds of miles of travel and large-scale coverage when disseminated from ground level under certain meteorological conditions. 1957, North Sea, east coast of Britain. It was shown that large area coverage with particles was feasible under most meteorological conditions. In addition, the Army admitted to spraying in Minnesota locations from 1953 into the mid-1960s. In St. Louis in the mid-1950s, and again a decade later, the Army sprayed zinc cadmium sulfide via motorized blowers atop Pruitt Lodge at schools from the backs of station wagons and via airplanes, a C-119 Flyer boxcar, the type of plane used to release the chemicals. Here we have CBS News. Secret Cold War tests in St. Louis cause worry. Look, this is something that is admitted. We have verifiable evidence that governments are constantly at war with their own people, not just there to protect you from others. You are the victim. No government has the right to initiate aggression, collect taxes, and use it on this bullshit, just as no one else does. So when asking ourselves, well, what are we really dealing with here? We cannot say bioweapons are off the table. We have the logical reason. It's not like these people are so moral. And we also have historical evidence.
It's so unbelievable, we didn't think it could possibly be true. But after receiving thousands of records and declassified reports from the Army, it's confirmed that during the Cold War, the United States military conducted secret tests on unsuspecting people in the city of St. Louis. A local sociologist will make her findings public tomorrow, but she spoke first to the I-Team's Lisa Zigman.
Lisa Martino-Taylor's life work has been to uncover details of the Army's ultra-secret military experiments carried out in St. Louis and other cities during the 1950s and 60s.
This study was secretive for a reason. They didn't have volunteers stepping up and saying, yeah, I'll breathe zinc cadmium sulfide with radioactive particles.
These Army archive pictures show how the tests were done in Corpus Christi, Texas in the 1960s. In Texas, planes were used to drop the chemical, but in St. Louis, the Army placed chemical sprayers on buildings and station wagons. City officials were kept in the dark about the tests. The Cold War cover story was that the Army was testing smoke screens to protect cities from a Russian attack. The truth, according to Martino-Taylor, was much more sinister.
It's pretty shocking. The level of duplicity and secrecy, clearly they went to great lengths to deceive people.
By making hundreds of Freedom of Information Act requests, she uncovered once classified documents that confirmed the spraying of zinc cadmium sulfide. The greatest concentration of this compound was sprayed near the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex just south of downtown St. Louis. It was home to 10,000 low-income people, and an estimated 70% were under the age of 12. Martino-Taylor claims they all unknowingly inhaled this compound morning, noon, and night, so the government could measure its effects on their lungs.
So this was in violation of all medical ethics, all international codes, and the military's own policy at that time.
In 1994, then Congressman Richard Gephardt asked the Army to open its records and explain the St. Louis testing.
We want to make very sure that nothing went on that would harm anyone and that all the facts are out on the table.
Documents released in the 90s show the Army placed sprayers on this former Knights of Columbus building on Lindell and in Forest Park. The Army always insisted the chemical compound was safe. Martino-Taylor believes documents prove otherwise.
There's a lot of evidence that indicates that people in St. Louis, in the city, particularly in minority communities, were subjected to military tests that was connected to a larger radiological weapons development and testing project.
For the first time, she links the St. Louis testing to a company called U.S. Radium, a company notorious for lawsuits involving radioactive contamination of its workers.
United States Radium had this reputation where they had been found legally liable decades prior for producing a radioactive powdered paint that killed many young women who painted fluorescent watch dials.
While the Army admits it added a fluorescent substance to the zinc cadmium compound, details of whether it was radioactive remain secret. Documents uncovered to date indicate the Army never conducted follow-up studies to see whether the compound caused long-term health issues. In 1972, after years of crime, poverty, and decline, the government destroyed the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex. Lisa Zigman, News Channel 5, I-Team.
Now, the company U.S. Radium no longer exists. Martino Taylor has placed all of her research, including the declassified documents, online, and will link you to that data at ksdk.com. Now, she will make all of her findings public tomorrow at St. Louis Community College Merrimack campus. In the meantime, if you remember the spraying, the I-Team's Lisa Zigman would like to hear from you. You can email her at lzigman@ksdk.com.